How do I get this to not be full screen? Okay, never mind. Go ahead. Sorry.
Welcome to week 2 of Bâtonnage Connect. Today we are going to dive into gender issues and how those can be very different among women in wine from different generations, and also when there's a family element involved, which is the case for many wineries here in California. So I'll introduce the moderator of this panel in just a moment, but first some housekeeping. You should have all received an email with a recap yesterday from last week's sessions, including links to the video recordings and a Q&A summary of questions that weren't answered live. So if you haven't received an email, please check your spam. And if not there, then just get in touch with us. And also remember, we have the virtual walk-around tasting going on now, featuring women winemakers and chefs, some offering some food and wine pairings. So be sure to check those videos out on the website. And now for our session today, we all know that one of the best parts of Bâtonnage is the personal interaction. And of course, that looks a lot different this year with the virtual platform. But last week, we saw a lot of interaction through the chat section and the Q&A. So I want to point those out to you. There are 2 ways to communicate. So the chat section and then the Q&A section. And these are different. The chat section is an informal way for you to communicate with other participants. So just be sure to select everyone in the to field, as it can default to panelists only. And then there's the Q&A section, and that is where we'd like you to submit your questions for our speakers to answer towards the end of the webinar. So we will do our best to address all the questions, and are happy to do follow-up for you as well. A recording of the session will also be available, so a link to that video will be sent to your email at the end of the week. And if you find yourself with streaming issues, you may want to encourage other members of your office or household to log off the internet to save on bandwidth. You may want to try logging out and logging back in with another internet provider such as Firefox or Chrome. And then that leads us to our panel today. So I am privileged to introduce our moderator, Kelli White. Kelli is the Director of Education for the Pacific Union Company in Napa Valley. Most recently, she was the Senior Staff Writer for the educational nonprofit Somm, where her work earned her 2 of the coveted Louis Roederer International Wine Writing Awards. Prior to that, Kelli worked as a sommelier for nearly a decade between New York City and Napa Valley. And in 2013, Food and Wine magazine named her one of the top sommeliers in the country. In 2015, she published her first book, the acclaimed Napa Valley Then and Now, which actually sits just behind me. And she recently contributed to the latest edition of Jancis Robinson and Hugh Johnson's World Atlas of Wine. She is a coveted speaker, has lectured on wine all over the world, and has appeared in the documentary Somm 2, Into the Bottle, as well as Somm TV. So I'll go ahead and hand it over to Kelli.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, first of all, to the original founders of Bâtonnage, Stevie and Sarah, and to the current operators, Katie and Rebecca. We are all really excited to be here and to be having this, I think, important discussion about gender across generations in the wine business and kind of at large. I also want to thank the previous moderators, Julia and Elaine, for setting a terrifyingly high bar. Hopefully we can honor the precedent you have established here. And I've got a wonderful panel of really impressive women that I am lucky enough to know and personally admire, in addition to professionally admiring. I don't know if you are seeing them in the same order I am, but please wave when I introduce you, although I'm sure everybody knows who you are. But to my immediate square to the left here is Beth Milliken. And Beth is the president and CEO of Spottswoode, an iconic winery here in Napa Valley. To my virtual right is Jasmine Hirsch, who is the general manager and winemaker for Hirsch Vineyards out on the Sonoma coast. And then down here, I have Jaime Araujo, who is both a partner in Accendo Cellars and also the owner of Trois Noix wines. So we're happy to have Jaime here. And then just beneath me is Anna Keller, and Anna is the estate director of the Keller Estate a winery out in the Petaluma Gap, and she also was really instrumental in getting that ABA drawn and established. So very esteemed women here. I'm completely intimidated, and I'm excited to get this rolling. And so, you know, watching the other panels was amazing. They went really well. And, you know, part of what I think made them so dynamic and exciting was the presenters themselves, of course, and the moderators, but also the questions at the end. So we're going to try, if possible, to wrap up our kind of semi-prepared, but still off the cuff bit a little bit ahead of time to open up the door to more questions, because we know what we want to talk about, but we want to know what you want to hear. So, so that's something that we're going to be keeping in mind and trying to do. So all of these women here are second generation vintners, which is pretty amazing. I love my family dearly, but I couldn't run a lemonade stand with them, never mind a winery. So I am very fascinated by the complexities of running a business, a multi-generational business in the wine industry. And these women are gonna talk to some of those complexities. We're gonna attempt to cover many topics here. We're gonna talk about family. We're going to talk about communications and boundaries within families. And we're going to talk about, of course, gender and gender bias, also about age and power. So we're going to cover a lot, and we're going to try and keep it moving. And I'm not going to watch the chat or the Q&A. We're going to let Katie and Rebecca moderate that and hopefully ping me questions as they arrive in real time. So no need to wait until the end to send them. We're going to try to address them as they come through. So. All right, let's get started. We're going to start with a big one. I think let's talk about last names, because specifically the way in which I think, you know, your last name as a family name for family winery, the ways that it's been a privilege in your life and the ways that it's been a burden. You know, I would imagine that it is able to open some doors, and that in some ways that maybe caused people within the industry to question your worth at having a certain job, or maybe it's gotten you places faster than you would have gone without it. And I know it's a double-edged sword. So I'd like to start with Jasmine a little bit, because you had some interesting points to say on that topic. What has your last name done for you in the wine industry?
Well, first and foremost, I was given a job by my father, so I didn't have to go through an application process. I knew nothing about the wine business when I joined the family company, so just there is an incredible access opportunity, incredible privilege, an unearned privilege, and you know, what I would say is that when you start to go into meetings with folks, and particularly with distributors or people who have been in the business a lot longer than you, you get that seat at the table simply because of your last name. So again, that's a privilege. That's a door that's open for you without you having personally done anything except be born to a certain parent, which you didn't have anything to do with. I think that, you know, for me, people would often comment on how young I looked or how young I was. And I always sort of took that as a challenge. So that was a challenge for me to prove that I belonged there, to prove that I could, you know, that I wasn't just a family name, that I actually had something of relevance to say and something to contribute. But I think that it's impossible to separate the position that I'm in from my last name. You know, it comes with, you know, internally within our family, it comes with such a sense of responsibility that can absolutely fall into the level of a burden. I mean, my father and I have had many different stages to our working relationship, which is inextricably intertwined with our personal relationship as father and daughter. And there have absolutely been points where I wanted to quit. I didn't think I could continue to work for him. And for lots of different reasons. And I didn't feel like I could quit. So, you know, that can be a very oppressive feeling, especially if it goes on for a long time. And, you know, I also would feel in those moments, not only can I not let my family down, but, what else would I do? Not so much that I couldn't get a job from someone else, you know, if I at that point had some years of experience in the wine business, but really what would be as meaningful as this sort of great intergenerational fight that I was engaged in with my father. And I use the word fight literally in that sense, but also now what I would say is more of a dance, a really beautiful dance with him. I think in that points to that, for me, this job is not about a job in the wine business. It's about a job trying to understand and perpetuate this amazing thing that my father has started. So yeah, it's complicated. It's a privilege, and it's at the same time, it's just a starting point.
And I'm sure that gender complicates the picture, for sure. And I'd like to follow up with Beth on that, because Beth, you started working in your family winery at a point when there were hardly any women in the wine industry in Napa Valley, never mind women in leadership positions. So how did that transition go? You know, what were the bumps like, and how has that changed for you over time?
So yeah, I don't get asked anymore, Jasmine, you know, how old I am, or being told that I look young, darn. But when I started, I was when I started here, I was 27, and I had been in the wine business when I graduated from university. I worked in San Francisco with a brokerage, and my mom, basically, she had started this winery when I was still. So just quickly, we moved here in 1972. I'm the only one of the panelists who never worked for her father. I've only worked for my mother because my father passed away at a heart attack when he was 44 and died in 1977 when I was in high school. And so when I went off to college, I had no idea what I was going to do, but I did know I was never going to come back to St. Helena. And we didn't have a winery at that time. We had this piece of land that my parents had bought in the early 70s. But we did not have a winery then. But I spent my years at university, went a year abroad, came back and got on the wine business in San Francisco, still with no intent of moving ever to Napa Valley, because we didn't even have a wine. And then we hadn't released a wine or even made it. And then ultimately in 1987, my mom just gave me a call. I was living in San Francisco, and asked me if I wanted to come and help out. And I came up and started helping out. It was a couple of days a week for literally probably 2 or 3 weeks, and it was just turned right into full time after that. So I didn't step right into a leadership role. There were hardly any of us here. It was my mom, and it was me, and it was Tony Soder, who was our vineyard manager and winemaker, and we were on our 3rd release of wine. So and also as a you didn't bring this up, but as a last name, obviously Novak is my maiden name, so I go by Beth Novak Milliken. I always like to have the Novak in there because that's my mom and dad's name. But you know, our winery is not named after a family name. So so that's one of the unique things where I don't carry this burden of walking in and saying, you know, I'm Beth Spottswoode. Thankfully, I'm not. Spottswoode was a historic name of the property, and that's the name that we adopted because that was the name of this historic property. So. But yeah, coming in 1987, did I come into a leadership role? I guess so. I certainly got the job because I was Mary Novak's daughter. I mean, why would she have called me otherwise? And I had been in the wine business, so I'm one of 5 children, and that made sense. I felt like Jasmine, that the burden of that was you had to really prove yourself, because otherwise, you know, you have to even work harder to prove yourself, because otherwise people are looking at you like you only have a job because you know, you're Mary Novak's daughter. Well, there's truth to that. That is why I was offered this opportunity. And so I've always felt that just working really hard and keeping your head down and just learning and listening and figuring it out was the best way.
I have a lot of sympathy for that position, because I feel like as a woman in the wine industry, and I know that Black women and women of color feel this even more acutely, that you already have to work so much harder, you know, to kind of feel like you earn, you know, what you have or what you've been able to get for yourself. I can see how it would be just another added layer of having to prove yourself.
Correct.
I mean, sorry if I can.
Yeah,
one of the reasons I actually started my whole career abroad was because there was very little chance that anyone would recognize my name. No, seriously, I wanted to get into the wine industry, but I didn't want to be associated with the family winery.
Yeah.
because I wanted to have my own, I wanted to be able to say, no, 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 I did this by myself. I did this on my own. And it has nothing to do with who my parents are.
Right.
And ironically, the very short-lived job that I did have at our previous winery at Araujo, and I think I went through 18 months of job interviews with my parents. So it cracks me up, like these people are like, oh, you just got this because of your name. I'm like, no, it was actually harder. It was actually more difficult because I am a family member. So our family's a little different that way, but yeah, it is definitely, I think, you know, you can tell sometimes when you walk in to a dinner or a meeting or a tasting and you're like, all right, this person I need to kind of blind with science very briefly so that they understand that, yes, I have the chops. It doesn't matter what my name is. Other people, it really doesn't matter. But there are those people who are the same way, you know, in previous companies and previous jobs I had, I still remember somebody going, oh, well, you know, people realize that you only got this because you slept with your boss. And I'm like,
Yeah, that's a big one too.
like, apart from how insulting that is, and ew, because my boss was like, ugh, but it was incredible. Like, it was just this, there has to be a reason. And I think there is this whole thing. And yes, in a family business, I think boys can get it too, because it's you're the child of. But I think for women, there's always that, like, there's always something, right? Some excuse why you're in this position of power.
Well, actually, my next question, Jaime, is I was hoping to direct it to you as well, because, you know, for those of you that were raised with brothers, or even those of you that weren't, you know, I'm wondering if there was any pressure from your parents or just general pressure from society to kind of funnel you into a more traditionally female part of the wine industry, like sales and marketing over, say, production, something like that. Is that a pressure that Jaime, you experienced, and how do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. There's always been this sort of like, Greg should be dealing more with the vineyard and Jaime should be dealing more with marketing. I love being out in the vineyard. Actually, that was never an option for me. It was just never, it was never offered. And it was never something I fought for particularly. But it's funny. There are certain things I think in a family business that are issues that you might think are because you're a girl, but it's actually because you're the daughter. It's you know, the difference between being a child of and being a woman. Sometimes you actually get the same, either being slightly undermined or people not valuing you at your true outside worth. And it's not necessarily because you're a girl, it's because you're a child.
So you're getting infantilized from two different angles.
Yeah, sort of. It's like infantilized and mansplained.
Yeah.
Hooray. But I think, you know, there's also, it's really interesting to me, and it's something that's started to get more concrete in my head, actually, since we've been working on this panel. I think I'm in slightly a strange position because I'm not in the position where, I mean, people like Beth, who is just like one of my biggest heroes in life.
Thank you.
No, for real. And who has always been like super supportive and super, just an incredible role model, sincerely. And I've always seen myself as being that, you know, in that child role, in that second generation role. And I think I'm kind of at this weird place where I'm sort of between two, because there are younger women coming up in generations below me who I've been kind of entering into as not a mentorship role, but you know, just sharing experiences and helping them feel like they can own their power a little bit more in these places. And I realized myself, you know, I need to stop thinking about being a child. It's one thing to, you know, but if you're an eternal victim, you're not going to get anywhere. So I think it's a very delicate thing when you're dealing with gender and with family, because there's a ton of intersectionality that happens. So.
Well, Jasmine, you recently made the transition inside your family business from, you know, more of operations to winemaking. Can you talk about that transition and how, what that was like both inside your company and maybe the perceptions from the outside wine industry were like?
Well, it's a bit, we haven't really spent a lot of time talking about or publicizing the fact that I've taken over the winemaking, because my first vintage was 2019. So I haven't really gotten a lot of feedback from outside the company. Those that have heard about it have been, it's actually been incredibly positive. Within the company with my father, when our winemaker left at the end of the 2018 harvest, it was unexpected, but we were at a good point with the wines where we didn't have to hire somebody else right away. So I took some time to consider what I wanted to do, and my father was okay. He was obviously, deeply informed and involved in all of these events that were happening, and but was willing to allow me to make final decisions on our winemaker leaving, on waiting to decide what we wanted to do. And then I did come to him and say, I want to take over the winemaking myself, and here's how I'm going to do it. And here's the consultant that I'm going to hire and the support structures that we're going to put in place in the winery, because I don't know how to make wine. My first responsibility is to the family's business and to its well-being, financial and otherwise. And there was no question that I'm going to suddenly come in and figure it out. That's not, we have there was, that's not an option, and I never thought of it as one. When I presented this to my father, he was incredibly supportive. So, that was a non-issue, but it was preceded by many years of us really fighting over control issues and power issues, and they had reached a point where I won't say that they were 100% resolved, but they were mostly resolved, and thus that transition was quite seamless, the winemaking transition. I mean, it was preceded by many years of working out these issues between the two of us. And we did that work, he and I both, so that when we did have this moment of what could have been a crisis for us as a company, losing our winemaker and it happening rather suddenly, instead was something that we were actually able to manage together quite well.
Well, that's great. And I think it's badass of you. So good on you and good luck with that.
Good luck.
You don't. My next question is for Anna. So Anna, in addition to being a woman, you also identify as Latino, and you have, you're of Mexican descent. Do you feel like you've faced an added layer of discrimination as a woman in power in the wine industry, and what's your sort of journey been like in that space?
Well, I identify as Latino basically because with the last name Keller, it's really difficult to communicate that you're Mexican American. But I was born and raised in Mexico City, and my family came to the U.S. to establish our family roots here in the late 1970s. So as far as needing, I guess for me, it has been, I wouldn't say that the Latino has added anything extra to it. I think that I already had the female going on, the child of going on, and the Latino really, as something that Jasmine said, all of these wineries, they're smaller or they started small. And so you were multitasking, and your first responsibility as in the family business was the welfare, the financial welfare of the company, which we all know is precarious in the wine industry. And so for me, the Latino aspect has come more in terms of how I manage relationships, and who kind of being very attuned to the perception that Latinos don't have as many options or are relegated. I always say that one of the things that hurts a lot is that our vineyard team, our landscape team, our maintenance team, any team that is composed of Latinos, they just become, the guys, and they become one mass, and they're not individuals. And so that for me has been the biggest part about adding the Latino factor to this, is making sure that we are all individuals.
And has this informed, internal company policies or practices, or have you kind of changed things over time to emphasize that?
Well, you know what, it's interesting because we're not big enough to have company policies that are so robust. I wish we did. I wish I had time to do that. It would be really important. But it is certainly something that I know that I can offer a space where somebody who can't speak English proficiently can come to me and we can hash out the cultural differences that there most likely will be, and how to adapt and how to grow within a company or not. Smaller companies, we don't necessarily have a structure where you can be graduating to the next level of position. So it does become a little bit harder how to create a structure for for all employees.
Right. Well, and this actually brings me to my next question, which is, you guys are all second generation vintners. So you inherited a company that functioned in a certain way. And then I would assume, I think I know that you have over time implemented certain changes, in terms of policy and training, maybe hiring practices or just general culture. Can you talk about the changes you may have made, how you presented them to the previous generations, and how it was received, and how the implementation is like? Anna, maybe you want to start, because I know you mentioned recently that you recently initiated sexual harassment training for your vineyard crews.
Well, last year it started, it's mandatory to have them now. And we started early on. I wanted to make sure we got a head start. And from the beginning, we were aware that we needed to have training in English and in Spanish. And so I spent half of the day, with the team that was training in English, and the other half of the day training with the team that was training in Spanish, specifically just to really have a better perception about how women feel. We don't have that many female employees in the company. It is, we are a state, so we grow our own fruit. We have our own vineyard crew, our own maintenance crew, our own landscaping crew, our cellar crew, and it's predominantly male. We have one female worker in our landscaping crew. We have, and we have women in the office, but we don't really have, except for me, women in higher, powered positions. Not that there's a lot of power, but it's still a company and there's hierarchy. And so for me, it was very interesting to see how women automatically in the session sat in the back. Latino women sat in the back, the men were in the front, and I could see the body language of who was understanding. And I wanted to sit next to them just so that they knew that I was with them, that we are understanding. And it's important to make sure we don't forget that they're, in my case, the minority that I have very close on a day-to-day basis is the Latino community. And I don't think you just really need to stand in a different way when it comes to supporting people who don't have necessarily the education, the advantage, or the culture, which is something that we tend to forget about the Latino population, is that it's a different culture and they didn't necessarily grow with understanding a joke in English. I always laugh, the concept buttercup, in Spanish, if you're a cup of butter, it's really not good. How you perceive kind of even just small words that you use are perceived very differently. So I think that was an initiative that we've continued to try to foment and give women and give men. I have 3 sons. So for me, it's really important that this conversation goes into the different generations, I think it's very important that men are part of the conversation and they understand and they grow. One of my kind of dad memories is I was crying one time because I couldn't be with my kids. It was an important academic moment and I was working. And one of the things he said, you know what, just remember what example you're setting out for them. That a woman can really, she does sacrifice. She may not be at every function or she may not be there for every moment, but you're setting an example. And hopefully when they go out into the world, they'll have a better understanding and they'll understand that sometimes their dad showed up, sometimes their mom showed up, sometimes grandma showed up because either mom or dad could. So I think that's also the difficulties, but also the beautiful thing that hopefully everybody learns, that we need to create a wider community. And maybe that's why we're here.
Yeah. And I think there is that extra burden on mothers. It's a well-worn trope that men never get asked about work-life balance in the way that women do. I don't know if Jaime, if you want to comment on that, or
No, it always used to make me insane because when I would travel for work, especially when the kids were small, the very first question anyone asks is, who's looking after your kid? Oh, who's with the kids? And I said to my husband, I was like, has anyone ever asked you that? Like, ever? And he was like, no, never. Right? It's systematically, when they find out I have children, the first question they ask. I'm like, oh, well, their father's looking after them. And the second question usually is, oh, how do you feel about that? Like, is that okay? I'm like, did I say I left them with the dog? No, like I left them with their father, like a parent. So there is that double standard for sure. And that can also be tricky to navigate within a family, because with the best will in the world, I think, or at least in our family, there is this, my brother's wife is a stay-at-home wife and mother, which is awesome and amazing. She's done an incredible job. And their daughter is like the most fabulous little human ever. But he has that support at home. My husband and I both work. And so we tag team and we trade off. And sometimes if I speak up about the fact that, like Anna says, like I'm missing something, I'm really sad, I'm missing that, or my kids are upset that I'm away, my parents will be like, oh, being a mom is the most important thing. You really need to stay home and not work. So I have to be very careful, because they're doing it with the best of intentions, absolutely. And yes, my family is my first priority on all levels. But I also am very proud of what I do professionally. I'm very proud of what I created, and that has an importance in my life. And I think, to Anna's point, I want my kids, my daughter and my son, to recognize that that's an important thing as a human being. Your family is incredibly important. Your children are incredibly important, but also what you have for yourself, and the job and the space that you make for yourself in the world has value. So yeah.
Great. And sorry.
No, go ahead. I was just gonna cue you up.
Perfect. Well, just to follow up on that, we did have a question come in that sort of addresses a very similar topic that both Anna and Jaime have been talking about. Though a few years away in the future for me still, I'm terrified of having children while working within the production side of wine. How do I manage having kids and still keep a focus on my career? But additionally, how do I avoid men in leadership changing their opinion of my ability to do my position once I have a child?
Oof.
Who wants to take that one? It's a great question.
It's a great question. I think definitely as a mother or as a parent, if you really are committed to your job and your career, you need to know what kind of support system you're going to be able to have. And that can take so many different forms. It can take the forms of family. It can take the forms of daycare and lots of different things. And I would say that please, 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 if you are doing what's right for you and your family, and if you feel comfortable and happy with it and your children are happy, please don't listen to anyone who's going to tell you that this is the right way to raise your child, or this is the right way, or you can't put them in daycare, or you can't have a nanny, or you can't let your parents look after them, or your husband, or whoever. Everybody has to find their own way, and there's no right way to do it. Anyway.
I would add that I think communication is really important. So what I would do is I would communicate with my supervisor, whoever that is, early on and frequently, and know that things are going to change. A lot of times I see that it's great personally, that if you're going to stay at home for 2 years with your baby, it's great, that's great, but kids last for a whole lifetime. So you can't just be there for the first 2 years. They're going to need you for, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, and you need flexibility, and things are going to change on a regular basis. So, communicate with your supervisor, extend the plans that you have in place, ask if those plans work for supervisor, female or male, and just try to get into a habit early on. And that goes the same thing for if you're just starting into the wine business or a family business. The sooner you talk about boundaries, the sooner they get established. A lot of us started in the wine business without really being asked. And so it took us maybe 10, 20 years to establish boundaries. So I think the same thing goes for having kids. It just it's start that conversation. They have to support you. It's not an option, and you have to know that. Don't doubt it. Don't doubt yourself about that.
If I can jump in here, actually, I'm pregnant, and thank you. I hadn't told the panelists yet, but I recently came out to work about it, and it was terrifying. You know, I understand that there are protections for women in the workplace in the United States and in California especially, and I still was you know, part of my brain was pretty sure somebody was going to find a way to fire me. It went really well, but it was a very scary conversation. And to be honest, you know, I'm doing this rather late in life. I just turned 40, and I had this kind of, I thought, funny monologue for the longest time about my like hesitation to have children, and that I didn't want to be a mom. I wanted to be a dad. You know, I wanted to have the career and come home and be the hero and like see them on the weekends and like, you know, cheer on the games. But I didn't want to do all that mom stuff. I didn't want to give up my job. I didn't want to, you know, go through the physical transformation. I didn't have romantic feelings about all that. And I thought because I didn't want to give that stuff up for a kid, it meant I didn't want a kid enough, which meant I shouldn't be a mom. And eventually I realized that was honestly, sorry in advance for the cursing, but kind of a fucked up position. And I was, you know, worthy of having that experience, and I could do it in my own way and still, you know, raise a happy, healthy child. And so I think that there's a lot of pressure on women that care about their careers. There's just this, I think, prejudice against you kind of can't have both, when I really do think that you can. It's complicated, but you can, and you have to honor yourself. You know,
you can have both. I mean, I have two sons, one who's 20 and one who's 18, and you know, you have to, it's not easy. I remember when they were quite young, I was like, wow, I don't know if I can do this, if I can balance all of this and make it all work. And then guess what, you figure it out, and you do find those structures, and you have to be, you know, what Jaime said is absolutely true. You do get asked, you get looked at differently as a woman if you're away from your children, if you're working and you're doing all that. And it's just going to take enough of us doing it and believing in what we're doing to make it feel like it's okay. And for people to understand that we can be good mothers, and that and as you said, Anna, I mean, it is not just the first 2 years. They need you then, but boy, when they're teenagers and they are exasperating, they are in those interesting years. You know, you really need to be there in the way that you need to be there. But my sons seeing me doing what I do, they've come to really understand it, and the passion that I have for it, and hopefully I'm building something that at least somebody will have an interest in, whether it's my own children or some of my nieces or nephews. That's my ambition, is to carry it forward and make sure that this is an interesting enough and inclusive enough environment that you know, if you have the aptitude and the passion, that you could, you know, have a place here. But it does take, there is no obligation to work here. There is no entitlement. So it is an earned position.
And I also want to jump in and say that, if I may, if you don't want kids, that's okay too. I mean, I think women are judged every which way to Sunday. You know, if you have a career and you have kids, you're judged. If you don't have a career and you're a stay-at-home mom, you're judged. And if you don't want kids, people are like, oh, that's sad, or that's weird. You know, I think you can't win, right? And so, you know, anything is legitimate. They're all valuable choices, you know, and don't let them get you down.
Absolutely. But I also would say, if you are in the industry and you are, you know, you have the conversation, you have the communication, you do everything you're supposed to do, and for whatever reason you're in a company or a position where you're getting pushback or you're feeling like there is an issue, this whole thing, this whole Bâtonnage community can be very powerful. And I think, you know, you have support around. If you are here, if you're listening, there is support. And so please don't, I think we also all have to be very aware of the fact that we do have to sometimes maybe speak out and speak up and say, yeah, not okay. In the same way that it's okay for everybody to have their choices. If somebody's doing their job and if they're doing it properly, and if there's, you know, we have to stop stigmatizing parents. because, you know, there are all kinds of different ways in which people might miss work, and it doesn't necessarily have to do with their children. Maybe they have an underlying health concern. Maybe they have aging parents. Maybe, you know, there's so many things. And just singling out women because it's obvious when you're pregnant, right?
Yeah.
Like, people do notice. And using that as a way to kind of undermine women in the industry, I think, has got to be called out.
Yeah, family winery. Go ahead.
I do think it's important to acknowledge the person who asked the question, I believe, specifically mentioned production. And I think it's important to acknowledge the specific challenges of being pregnant while trying to do production work. I mean, production work is very physical. It's part of the job description for somebody who does cellar work, that they're able to lift a certain weight and do certain physical tasks. I mean, that's part of the job. How can we, I mean, particularly in a small, we only have 2 people that work in the cellar year round. I mean, we have more people during harvest. What would it mean for us as a business if somebody working in the cellar decided that they were going to have a child and became pregnant and they were not physically able to do their job anymore? I don't have an answer for that. I have not had that situation arise, but it is something that as an industry we do need to talk about. And we do, you know, obviously there's the legal protections, but there's also that feeling that the questioner put forward, which is this feeling that exists all around us, that if we do, I mean, and Kelly, you said you felt it in your job, that if we do decide to become pregnant, that it will change the way my company views me, or my manager or my colleagues view me. And then, you know, besides just the physical aspects of production work, there's also the way the work changes throughout the year with harvest. And I've known a number of women who work in production who have started families while working as winemakers. And I myself don't have children, so I can't speak to that experience, but I think it is something that I will admit that I have personally remarked either to myself or to somebody else, wow, like, I hope they're not due in September. And that's a form of bias for me to say that, but it is a reality when one is thinking about starting a family. But I would also say that these problems also affect men that have children, if their partner works, and how they deal with childcare during harvest, in particularly during harvest. And I don't have any answers, but I just would like to acknowledge it. I think you cannot work and do the exact same job up till you're ready to deliver like you can if your job is not physical, or many women can do if their job is not physical. So I just think production, there's some particular challenges, and these challenges may be a reason why, you know, we don't have more women on the production side, one of the reasons. And so I would love more conversation about this topic as somebody who is managing a cellar crew, and may have an employee that makes that choice, and how would I support her while also keeping my small business running? And if some of the other panelists have experience with this, I would love to hear what their experience was.
I also think that this is a concern for other parts of the industry, like the restaurant industry. It's no coincidence that I waited until I was out of the restaurant business to make this step. I mean, that is a business that's very, I think, difficult to have a family in and around. And I think that's part of the reason why we don't see too many older sommeliers, especially older women sommeliers. And we are, you know, talking about age also in this panel. And that's, you know, that's also a consideration, not just where the gender gap is in certain positions within the wine sphere, but also, you know, how age kind of stratifies according to, you know, stages of life and what you can do with family.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's up to us in a way as employers and small business owners to start looking at ways we can be a little more innovative in the ways that maybe we reorganize jobs around certain events in people's lives. I think that, and you know, that may not always be possible. It may just not be possible. It may be that, you know, people do have issues in pregnancy, and maybe all of a sudden somebody has 6 months of bed rest and they're not allowed to even come to the office, much less anything else. So, and that is something, yeah, that needs to be dealt with, and in a small business can be really, really difficult to manage. But I do believe that if we really think about it and if we really have the will to do it, we can find ways in which we can make those adjustments for the, because it's also, I mean, thankfully, pregnancy does not last forever, right? Yes, children, you have them for your whole life.
I already.
It doesn't. It will be over.
Yeah.
It will be over. But no, and I think, yeah, it can be a pain in the ass, and God forbid, you know, worst case scenario, your entire team is female and they all end up delivering right at harvest. Like, what would you do? I think it would be a pretty rare occurrence, but I also think that, you know, we have one of our winemakers, his wife had their baby right at harvest, and he's a very involved parent, and he wanted, you know, he was there and everything, and we worked around it. Other people took on bits and pieces of his job. We have a fabulous office administrator right now who's just getting ready to deliver. And, you know, she had to take a break because she was doing too much. And yeah, it's not ideal, but it's totally doable. And other people took on bits and pieces. And I think that's also part of a smaller family business, maybe, that you can, a lot of people are a little more polyvalent. And so you can actually take on pieces for a bit and fill in those gaps with other people. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's great. I mean, there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen around making family-friendly workforces in general, and that's going to just aid to getting a critical mass of women in certain spheres in the wine industry for sure. But I'd like to pivot the conversation. That was a great question, by the way, for whoever contributed that. But I'd like to maybe jump back onto the programming and talk a little bit more about generations, because that's one thing we're supposed to talk about. And so I'd like to direct this next question to Beth. And that your story is really unique because you inherited, as has already been touched upon, you inherited your operation from your mother, and your winery is often referred to as a bit of a matriarchy, which I think is cool and rare, you know, in the business. And so, you know, how are things different in terms of being a woman in the wine industry and in terms of being a woman in a leadership position different for your mother than they are for you? And how are they, do you see, different from you than women that are just assuming these roles in the industry around you?
Yeah, I mean, I think for my mom, you know, she sort of ended up in this in a sense, right? My dad died and we had bought this property, and some friends, Duckhorns and Schaefer's, were buying her fruit and loved it and sort of encouraged her to realize their shared dream and make wine. And so she jumped in 1982, 5 years after my dad had died. And I came on not that long thereafter. So in a way, and by the way, Spottswoode is family owned. So I'm one of 5 children, and I do run the business, and I have that ability to run the business through a lot of really good estate planning that my mom and I and our family did over many years. I mean, it was probably 25 years of estate planning. And one thing I was thinking of when I was reading through your notes, Kelly, that you had put together for this is, you know, my mom's thinking, I think, changed. How did it feel for her? I don't think she ever really felt like she was like running the winery. She was so happy to not have to do things. So she was, and I'm not saying she was lazy, she just did not want to do the day-to-day. You know, she just did not. So not long after I was hired, we hired a woman named Pia Armstrong, who and so we sort of built this business together. My oldest sister, Lindy, came on 5 years after I did and did sales. She had been in the clothing industry. But then over the years, you know, we worked with this amazing estate attorney who was female. And I think through all of that, my mom came around to seeing that, wow, you know, females are, I mean, she had brought me on, but, you know, wow, we can do it, and we have the ability to make anything happen that we want to happen. So I guess I would call myself sort of generation 1.5 in a sense, because I really helped my mom build this, which I feel really fortunate for. And she's not with us anymore. So she passed away in the fall of 2016. And so now I'm doing it, and I was doing it before, so it hasn't felt that different. It hasn't felt that different for me on a day-to-day in terms of running of the business. My mother was my North Star, and I miss her all the time. She was a remarkable person. But yeah, how it's different and how it will be different for the next generation. That's an interesting thing to say. You know, I always look at, say, Michaela Rodeno or Dawnine Dyer or people like that who were sort of not quite a generation up, but maybe a decade ahead of me, who sort of plowed the ground and made it so that we could come in and do more here. And how it will look for the next generation, I think that I hope that that women feel, I just don't think the next generation sees as much bias, as much issue. I remember my mom having the conversation when I was getting, she was trying to give me pretty minuscule raises. It was finally Kate Olath, our state attorney, who said, this isn't quite right. You want to be being paid a little bit more. And mom's concern was, well, I don't want you earning more than your husband. I'm like, okay. I mean, it didn't upset me. It was like, that was just a really interesting view that she had, because that's how she was raised. And then I was able to explain that and say, well, Mom, that's not really a current way of thinking, and that's just not a problem. But it is fascinating, because I even saw in the chat that somebody said, that they had a female in a role, and they hired a male into that same role, and the thought crossed her mind. It was should I pay this man more than the woman who this role was being paid? And then she quickly realized, what am I thinking? So we all have these types of biases, and hopefully those are minimizing as our next generations come along.
Yeah. I mean, pay transparency and career counseling is, I think, one of the biggest things that's needed to advance women in leadership positions is,
right.
How to negotiate for pay. I can't even imagine what's that like inside of a family when your boss is your father. That must be quite hard.
And again, I never had to deal with that, luckily.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk about communications and communication strategies a little bit, because I think that this might be really valuable for the attendees at this particular moment in time. I think we are experiencing right now at this moment in America and around the world a particularly dynamic and transformative time in social history, right? First the COVID crisis kind of laid bare and exacerbated economic disparities in our country and around the world. And now the Black Lives Matter protests against racism in general and police brutality in particular are lighting the world on fire, and if you are really committed to doing the work and not just posting receipts on Instagram about what a good person you are, then you're probably, hopefully, having some really difficult conversations, some invisible behind the scenes work with people that are in your life. And, unlike strangers on Instagram or friends that you can unfollow and walk away from, if these are people you're bound to in terms of blood, your family, or in terms of running a business together, business partners, or your spouse, your parents, your children, you need to keep these people in your life. You love them. You may not agree with them, but you want to bring them around to your way of seeing and thinking. You want to change their perceptions. So do you guys have any advice for the people listening as to how to have these hard conversations where you don't see eye to eye with people that you love and that you can't just cancel? Jasmine, would you like to start? Because you've referenced this battle you've had over the years with your father a bit. What's worked for you?
Well, I think it's very easy. It was very easy, especially early on in my relationship working for my father, to fall into the role of victim. My father was very much a hard ass and difficult person to work for, not just for me, but for a lot of our colleagues, a lot of our employees, and for my siblings. I mean, he was, as my mother would say about my dad, get it in writing, and so as I got older, and then he had a life-changing accident in 2014 that has left him paralyzed. But for even before he came back to work, he was almost 2 years in hospitals, and just a really long journey. I mean, he really changed a great deal. But even prior to that, we had reached a pretty good place before that accident happened. And a big part of that was me recognizing that it was all very well and good for me to feel the primacy of what I needed or wanted. But as partners, I was not going to be able to get what I want, nor were we going to be able to achieve our shared goals if I didn't also recognize what he needed and wanted. So my father's obviously a lot older than me. He expects to outlive his wife, my stepmother, and making, just as one example, I as a young person, not married to this woman, right? I was not really thinking about her well-being after he passes away. It was very important for him that I understand and commit to helping to care for her when he's gone. And so that's just one example of something that does not fall into my bucket of individual wants or needs. It falls into his. But unless that need of his was met and honored, our shared goals around the business and the land and the family couldn't be achieved. So I think looking at what and honoring as legitimate the other person's real needs, even if you can't really comprehend them because you're a different age, you're in a different position, is so important to achieving shared goals. But I'll still say there are things that my father just doesn't seem to get. I mean, we've had some issues within the company around sexual harassment that for me, it's black and white. I said, that person has to go. And my father's like, well, he didn't do this. Like there was some, and I'm like, are you kidding me? That's the line? No way. And I said to him, this is, not that long ago. So past when I was throwing tantrums, I said to him, this person goes where I go. I mean, like there's no, but he didn't get it. And I think if I went back to him even now and said to him, how do you feel about this? He would say he still didn't really feel that it was a problem. And is that generational? Is that gender? I think it's both. And my father's, a very caring, he's completely changed since his accident, a very caring, thoughtful person. But just, there's still things that I say to him, just trust me on this one, like this, we need to go in this direction on this particular issue. And, but we trust each other now, so.
Well, and I think to your point, I think it's been really important for me. I've always been sort of a different personality than the rest of my family. I've had different experiences and I have different viewpoints. But it's been really important for me to respect the fact that advancing social justice and changing people's ideas, it's a journey, and we're not all at the same place on the road. And just because somebody is maybe a bit behind me doesn't mean they're not making their journey. They're just not where I am. And so I can be helpful in showing them the way. I can be helpful in hopefully getting them to, giving them a cart so they don't have to walk, giving them a bike. But it's important to approach it with respect, I think. Even if it's hugely frustrating and you wish it went faster, I think that's the only way. And I think it's partly because we are family, right? We don't have the choice to be like, screw this. I can't even deal. Like, I can't even get there. I'm going somewhere else where people understand this. But I think that's helpful. I think that's useful because if you're already breaking down open doors, it's not doing much in the overall scheme of things. It's harder work and it's more painstaking probably, but hopefully it's also creating a better place for everybody.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
What I was gonna just add to that is one of the things I think we all fail to do, both as women and especially in family relationships, is I always used to show everything I had done and then ask for the raise at the end of the conversation. We never really got to the end of the conversation because, then it was lunchtime and the family time, it blurred into family time. And so one of the best advices that I could give is just make sure you focus. You really don't put yourself first. That's probably the hardest conversation to have, is to put your needs. I really love what you said, Jasmine, and I'll take that advice because sometimes you don't think of other people's buckets, but don't forget to be very clear on your bucket and put that information out before anything else happens in a conversation. And I guess that goes for family, but it goes for other portions of other jobs.
Well, and Anna, what you said about boundaries earlier, I know we kind of glossed over it, but I think that's huge.
I'd like to talk for a little bit about age for women in the wine industry, because I think, we can all agree that there is this perception for men, not just in the wine industry, but, Hollywood, everywhere, that they sort of gain in value as they get older, right? The venerable advisor, there's at every stage of a man's life, there's, potentially a room for wage increase and more respect and so on. And for women, it's obviously not the same. If anything, if a man's, arc is like this, a woman seems to be more of a bell curve, right? You gain in value and expertise. People start listening to you, maybe taking you more seriously as you get a little older. And then maybe at a certain point, your value seems to start to potentially decrease. Now, obviously that's not true. But I don't want to address this question on anyone in particular. This is a voluntary only answer. I was wondering if you all had comments to make about your own journey in the wine industry, because we've all been at it a while, and how that's changed as you've aged, for better and for worse.
I've had kind of a weird one, because I had gotten to a point in my career where I was sort of starting to feel that, when people don't want to hear that I'm 50, which is weird. They're like, oh, no, you totally don't look 50. Oh, you can't be 50. I'm like, I'm completely 50. I love being 50. Like, I own all of those 50 years. And why is that weird? But there's also this thing of, because I'm the second generation, I joke with people, I'm like, this is literally the only industry in the world where I'm 50 years old and I'm the kids, right? so it is kind of a strange balance of being a child and yet an elder. But again, I would say, as far as our industry is concerned, and again, I'm sorry, Beth, I'm like giving you all kinds of, but no, I mean, Beth, and Naoko, and our winemaker, Francoise, and Donine, and Michaela, and I mean, even, people like Barbara Isley, was just such a rock star. These women were so, and they just owned it. And I think they were great models for younger women coming up in the industry.
Yeah, and I don't, on the age thing, because clearly I would say that I'm probably the senior member of this crew. And what's funny is that when I started in this business, I was 27. I was like always the youngest one in the room, right? And I always remember, I can't even remember exactly when it was, but some of us have had that experience where all of a sudden you're in a meeting, or you're in some staff thing with a sales team or whatever, and you look around, you're like, oh, I think I'm actually like the older person in this room. And it's one of those really, because as you don't feel like you're older. I don't, I'm out on my mountain bike and I'm doing all this stuff, and I have kids that are teenagers, and I'm just running around, and you never think of it, and then you're like, oh wow. So it's one of those funny things where even my mom, when she was amazing, and she turned like, maybe it was when she turned 80 or 81 or whatever. She's like, you never feel the age that you are, and I think that's such a great thing, right? That we just keep. So I don't really think about my age that much. I mean, not that I don't get freaked out, because I don't look forward to birthdays at a certain point, although the alternative is worse. Of course, I'd rather have a birthday to celebrate than not be here. But, it is kind of funny. It is that funny realization, that probably, maybe Jasmine, you haven't had it yet, but when all of a sudden you look around, you're like, oh yeah, that used to be me, right? And you've moved forward, but that's okay.
This being said, Beth, I think it might also be different for those of us who are in management or running companies.
Right.
I think it's a very different thing if, say, you're on the sales side.
True.
If you're a rep, or if you're in the restaurant and hospitality side. I think
good point. That's actually a very, very good point.
Yeah, I mean, I know, I only turned 40, and some days that feels old and some days it feels young, it depends on sort of what's going on that day. But, I had a kind of career crisis a couple years ago where I wanted to get out of a job, but I didn't have another opportunity lined up. And I remember talking to a friend who was like a loving friend, not a jerk, and saying, well, what am I going to do? I could do this, I could do that. And then I said, well, I could be a brand manager. And they're like, oh, you're a little old for that. So, I mean, this is the real thing that happens. And it seems like someone has decided that for the jobs that women can occupy in the wine industry, that there's an ideal age and level of experience for all of them. And I think that we all have to work really hard to just break that completely down, because, just like men, I think we get valuable the older we get, as our expertise and experience grows, and we should get, compensated more the older we get, and we should have more opportunities and not less. And that's not currently what's happening.
Sure.
Well, I just saw somebody said men decided, and I think it's time for us to start deciding what the different levels are for women and what women can do. One of the things that I think it's time for us to turn around, and at one of the first Bâtonnage, we had a wonderful conversation about, you know, the value of young women in our business and the different perception and what they bring to the. I think if the more we can honor younger generations of female, you know, women doing whatever they are, whether they're in production, whether they're in sales, whether they're communications. I think that we need to start establishing goals and talk about them. And you know, I love that I have two female, you know, colleagues doing our social media, because they clearly understand it much better than I. And I think that if we give the next generation, we hand off the baton sooner rather than later. Yeah. It helps create those new levels of understanding of what females can do and what they are doing.
And in the vineyard, I mean, I know it's relatively recent that we've had women in our vineyard crews, but I would love to see a point where we've got some of those women actually running the crews and getting into vineyard management. I think that would make a huge difference in the way that the job is perceived. And I think it would make a huge difference in the way that those teams work.
You know, we are already over time. I have a couple more questions, but I just want to check in with Rebecca and Ella and see, are there any questions from the crowd that we should be addressing?
You know, I think we've got all of those compiled that we can go ahead and send to you by email and get those out to the attendees with the recording, just to not prioritize any over the others. So if you've got maybe one final question that you'd like to pose to the panel, we're happy to go a little over. And yeah,
great, thank you. You know, the last question, you know, is just that from my understanding and talking to the founders of Bâtonnage, is that the idea for this panel came out of a heated discussion last year for a panel that I think was called "Do You Sell Sex?" That wherein some women in the audience, you know, took umbrage with the way a lot of younger women in the wine industry present themselves on social media, or you know, are maybe more sexual in, you know, their personal branding and things like that. And it laid bare some of the struggles. You know, we've talked a lot about, you know, what was different for the older generations, but do you struggle with some of the expressions and ways of being of the younger generation? You know, how are they inspired? How did they inspire you, and how do they frustrate you? You know, what are the issues there?
So just for me, I'll be really quick. I mean, we have a great group of younger people in their 20s and in their early 30s, and I think they're awesome. I love their energy. I love having them here. We have not had issues of dress. I didn't hear that other one, but they're just great. They just bring a different and really important sort of dynamic to the company, and they just energize me. I love having them around. I mean, I'm pretty energetic anyway, but they just have a different viewpoint, and you know, you sit there. That's another one of those funny things. I'm kind of like, oh, actually, I could be your mother, right? I mean, you know, that's also one of those funny things. Like, yeah, I could be. I'm not, but I could be. And I think it's really fun to work with people who are of that generation. I think it's just fascinating, and they're what they know. Their body of knowledge and what they're familiar with, and their you know, just perspectives are really beneficial, and I enjoy them personally and professionally.
Well, I can come and jump in. Oh, Jasmine, sorry, go.
Oh no, I just want to say, I think women should have the right to dress however they want and be taken seriously. And, you know, just to get to basics, like, you should be able to wear whatever you want and walk down the street and not have to deal with catcalls or, God forbid, being assaulted. That being said, there's never an expectation for men to look sexy when, let's just say, in a sales role, right? I think all salespeople need to look presentable and need to, I mean, there's uniforms, whether they're, you know, assigned or not, for lots of different industries. And I think, you know, but what I guess what I would say is why I definitely dressed in a more provocative way when I got into this industry when I was younger. I started in 2008 when I was 28, so around the same age as Beth. And I definitely, I think whether it was with dress or with attitude, was more flirtatious, using femininity or sexuality as a way to build relationships or sell wine. Now the idea of doing that is so, I just can't, for me personally doing that, I would almost say the word abhorrent to me, because I don't want my worth to be based on how I look. I want it to be based on my ideas, my creativity, my hard work, my execution. And but I still think we have to allow for freedom of expression. And if people want to dress a certain way, that should be their right. But I do think we need to ask ourselves, why do we lean on a provocative, personal appearance in the workplace when there would never be such an expectation of a man? And what does that bring to our work, and what does it maybe take away from our work? I think we all have to have this conversation with ourselves. And for me, I really don't want to be watched, my body to be watched anymore. I don't want that gaze, and I don't at all, period. And I also don't want that to be a component of my presentation of my business. That's my personal opinion on it.
I relate to that, and I had a completely, honestly, opposite experience. When I was getting started in the business, and especially when I was starting as a sommelier in New York, I really felt that in order to be taken seriously, I sort of had to erase my gender and not be sexy. And so I wore, low ponytails and little makeup and even a sports bra to sort of diminish what I got going on. And so and even then, many customers, not all of them, had a difficult time, taking me seriously. I thought that expertise was a masculine, quality. And so that was something I wanted to exude. And I found out recently that the owner of the restaurant used to complain bitterly that I wasn't dressing sexy enough. So, you can't win either way you go. So you might as well just be your authentic self. And, but I will say, as far as generational tension, there are moments where I have to check my own reaction to younger women. If I see, beautiful female sommeliers dressed in a provocative way, I have a mixture of emotions. Sometimes I feel pride and obviously admiration for the self-confidence. And then there are times where I feel jealousy, or judgment, because I know it's probably just all those years in ill-fitting suits, but I have to check myself and celebrate that instead of judging it, because there's way too much judgment, just in our gender in general from other people, other genders and other ages. The worst thing we can do is start applying that to each other, so
I think we also have to be really aware of the fact that, like Beth says, to the point of having younger people in the winery adds this great energy, but it also, those younger people are our next consumers, right? And so if there are changes in the way that people are expressing or using or dealing with something like dress codes and sexuality, I think we also have to be, in the same time that we can mentor to an extent to ensure that they are expressing their authentic selves and not responding to some sort of masculine code that they think will get them ahead. I think we can support younger women in that way. But I also think we need to listen and understand that maybe there are things we imagine are, like the uniform or the way to represent the brand or whatever, that might be doing us a disservice with the younger consumer, because they're actually not responding to a generational shift in attitudes. So I think the communication hopefully will go both ways.
We have a lot to learn from both generational directions, I think.
Exactly.
is the key takeaway, and we have to be, open to it. And it's overplayed, but we are all in this together, yeah. So, and I'm seeing in the chats, I can't see complete, but I'm seeing sentence fragments. Yeah. And then there's the whole issue of race too, and how much harder you have to work to be taken seriously, and, the extra care and thought you have to go into how you dress, if you aren't white. It's layers and layers and layers of complexities and hurdles and barriers. And, we have to just lift each other up, whenever we can. So that's, I think, it, guys. We are 15 minutes over because we have so much to say. And I wish we could do this all day. So I guess we're going to answer the remaining questions on email. And just thank you to my fellow panelists. Again, thank you to Katie and Rebecca, and to Stevie and Sarah, and to all the sponsors, and to the other panelists and the other moderators, and just the entire wine world of women. I love you all. This was wonderful. Thank you for having me, and thank you for having us.
Thank you to our panel. This wraps up our first part of the Bâtonnage Connect program. So again, thanks so much to our panel today. Thank you to our session sponsor, Gabrielle Glass. So next is the first of 6 breakout sessions. So if you have an all access pass, you'll have links to all of these webinars, while those with select passes will have access to just one. So check back in the confirmation PDF you received for that information. And tomorrow's breakout features a group of boss ladies in the fizz biz with the Fizz is Female. And that's going to be tomorrow, Thursday, June 25th at 10 a.m. Pacific. So see you then, and thanks to all of you for tuning in today. Also just want to give a shout out to our 2020 charity partners. So thank you all, and we'll see you tomorrow.